I'm so happy to be here. And I do love Malaprops. That was always a highlight of the week when we would be in Swannanoa. We'd come into town and browse the bookstore. And you were always at readings and events selling books. So it's really an honor to be reading with you and to be connected to your community. Such an incredible town of readers. So thanks for having me. So the book Benjamin Banneker and Us, this is a book of creative nonfiction, and it is about my own ancestry. So in 2016, I discovered I was actually in Asheville at my aunt's house and learned that we were descended in part from the sister of Benjamin Banneker. And I hadn't known that we had any African American ancestry, and certainly hadn't known that we had ancestry that went back to a famous Black figure. So like any writer, I was very excited. I wanted to research these ancestors right away. And I started doing that. And because Benjamin Banneker was famous in his lifetime, I was able to learn not only about him, but also about the women in the family. And to go back to the late 1600s, which this family line began with Molly Welsh, who was an indentured servant from England, and Banneker, who was a kidnapped and enslaved man from Senegal. So I started doing the research. I started working with the stories, but I had very big questions about the ethics of me writing this book as a person who had not been raised in Black culture and whose family had passed as white generations before. So as I was asking those questions and kind of on pause, a cousin got in touch with me and said, we need to talk about our family. And that was my cousin, Edie Lee Harris. She brought me into the fold and put me in touch with my African-American cousins and a whole group of people who had done their own research and who had really held the family stories and had incredible stories, not only of the Banneker families, but then the descended families that left Maryland and went up into Ohio and lived as free people of color, sometimes as indentured people, sometimes as enslaved people, but all find ways to work together, to participate in the Underground Railroad, and to really try to protect their freedom and their children's freedom. So again, it was an incredible interlinked group of stories, and then it became a collaborative process with my cousins. So the way the book moves is it moves with present tense chapters, present day chapters, set today, many of which are conversations between me and my cousins, and then historical chapters. And the historical chapters are based on research. We do know about the Banneker family, so they're based on documentary research and then oral histories. And then I also imagined into them to build out the scenes and give a connection to the ancestors. So I will read one sort of short passage about Mary, and this is Benjamin Banneker's mother, Mary Banneker. And we did know things about her. We know that she was very industrious. She ended up cooking and selling food at the local mill for the working men. And she was also a healer and an herbalist who knew how to work with nature. But while I was working on the book, we also discovered new documents pertaining to Mary. So you'll see that I kind of move through those modes of storytelling. This is Owella, Maryland, 1700s. When I imagine Mary, I sense her grace and capability. She raises the wooden yoke to her shoulders to walk to the well for water. She packs a wagon with baskets of bread and bacon, apples, boiled eggs, greens, and hominy, and heads to Ellicott's mills to feed the working men their lunch. She chases down a chicken and quick snaps its neck, then plucks its feathers right there at the edge of the woods. She watches the feathers take to the wind and knows what the weather's going to do. The land was animate to Mary, a vast network of plants and creatures that she observed respectfully and in detail. She could see where plants liked to grow and which plants they favored as their neighbors. She noticed when they were sodden at the root, or had a blight burrowing into the leaves, or when they were almost glowing with good health and healing. Each plant had a meaning and a purpose, a specific way of working. Sometimes the plant's appearance announced its healing properties. The red vesicles of the ruby mustard, for instance, would clean the blood and keep it running, while the sponge-like yellow of the yarrow would break a fever. Mary had learned the English cures and physics from her mother, Molly, had learned West African cures and medicines from her father, Banneker, and had gleaned additional plant medicines from her neighbors. And she added to that knowledge to her own observations. This gave her a lifelong ability to gather healing leaves, roots, and barks from the woods, and to know which plants to have on hand in her garden. Later, Benjamin Banneker would include receipts and cures in his almanacs, much like those he had learned at home from his mother, including recipes to treat whooping cough, asthma, and jaundice. Mary Banneker had a great interest in herbs, wrote Benjamin's biographer Silvio Bedini. During her years on the farm, she sought out woodland plants that had medicinal value, and she collected information about herbs and remedies from her neighbors. She raised sassafras, ginseng, and snakeroot. She also sought out the bayberry bushes and carefully collected the berries useful for making candles. Mary knew that for both bodies and land to thrive, they had to be brought into balance. Burn back that bramble wanting to take over. Cart buckets up from the river full of mud and water weeds to feed the soil that was getting tired. The body was little different, so when Mary was doing a healing, first she tuned in to what was too wet or too dry, and then she let the body itself tell her what it needed. Sometimes the cure would come to her stark and sudden, based on her years of study. Then she'd make a tincture or a tea, infusing it as she worked with her prayers, in which she pictured the person working, walking, laughing, whole, the bleeding stemmed or the fever cooled, and balance restored to the body. Mary respected her mother's God and her father's Allah, but she saw divine intelligence most clearly in nature. These stories about Mary all take place later in her life, after she had married Robert Banneker and had become the mother of Benjamin Banneker. We have never known what Mary's life was like before those years. But in 2021, a researcher stumbled upon an entry in the Maryland Provincial Court records from May 1731 that provides a window into Mary's early life. The trial opens with a mulatto woman, Mary Banneker, arguing for her children's right to freedom. She begins her testimony by saying that she, your petitioner, was born of a white woman who was a servant of John Newman in this county. She then explains that she was indentured until the age of 31, when she was adjudged to be free by the justices of Baltimore County. And while she was in servitude, she had several children born of her body, including Sarah Lett, Zachariah Lett, and Deborah Lett. She attests that she has paid 7,000 pounds of tobacco for the children's keeping to a landowner named William Rogers, and tells the court that even so, her children have been unjustly charged with indenture. Like Mary herself, the children had done nothing wrong to be charged with this indenture, but had simply been born of the union with an African man. Mary goes on to argue for her daughter Sarah's freedom. Her claims reach their highest pitch when she declares that the indenture ruling is erroneous and repugnant, and that her daughter Sarah is by law entitled to her freedom. Mary then beseeches your honors to order a citation against William Rogers and to adjudge her children to be free when they attain the age of 16 and 21 years. The note following the testimony records that William Rogers was summoned for a trial and that Mary Banneker did, in fact, win her case. This extraordinary document tells us that Mary spent her first 31 years in indentured servitude. It informs us that Molly, her mother, was a servant of John Newman. And it suggests that her father, Banneker, and her mother, Molly, were not as fortunate as earlier biographers had hoped. It seems that Molly had not been able to free her husband or her child, and was subject to a Maryland law that sentenced her daughter Mary to servitude just because she was born of the union between a British woman and an African man. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for introducing the book to us and for that lovely reading. Also moving and informative. And I'm going to start with a question about your cousins who you mentioned earlier, but then we're going to get back to the form of the book and how you chose to write it the way you did. But first off, I'd love to hear more about how you collaborated with your cousins, what that word cousin means to you at this point, and to the folks that you collaborated with as well, and what that process looks like.
That's a great question. And I love the addendum to the question, what it means to us. So I definitely felt a familial connection. We all did as soon as we began talking. And we are connected through DNA. So we're sixth to seventh cousins. So not first cousins, did not grow up knowing each other. But I had published a short essay called White Lies and Fiction. And it was a tiny little essay stating that my family's passing into whiteness was mirrored in the larger culture, in the sense that it was a denial and a losing track of Black genius and Black presence in our origin stories. So I had published this little short essay saying that and mentioning a couple of the ancestors. And Edie found that 2 years later. And that's how she found me and got in touch with me. And we had a pretty amazing connection where we felt connected. We felt familiarity. We kind of began in the middle of the conversation. And Edie had done 40 years of her own research and had connected 15,000 people in a family tree. So she is a very thorough genealogist. And then she brought me into this connected group of Banneker-Lett descendants, which included Robert Lett, who's also very prominent in the book. And he stays in touch with a remarkable number of people. So basically, I started having these weekly conversations, many times more than weekly, with them. And then also with our cousin Gwen Marable, who's another prominent person who's 90 years old, completely conscious and brilliant, and a very graceful person spiritually. And she was fundamental to establishing the Benjamin Banneker Park and Museum in Baltimore County, Maryland. So I got to know them, and it was very important for the present day work. It was important for me to be in close contact and honest conversation with my Black cousins who had grown up in Black culture, who had experienced American history from that point of view, because I knew that I couldn't write that. I could expand myself imaginatively. I could do research, but they were going to have insights that I needed and I wanted to learn from. So that became part of it. But then also there was almost a crowdsourced aspect to the research that sped everything up, because they generously shared their own research. I was frantically reading and researching, but the section that I read from had this new document that surfaced while I was actually finishing the book. And it came from Paul Heinig, who does a database of free African Americans in the Eastern Seaboard. He found the document, let Robert know about it, who let me know about it. And so Edie and I traveled to Maryland and went to the Maryland archives to see the documents ourselves. So that gives you an idea of how collaborative it really was. And I still talk to them every week, and I've been touring with the book and seeing them. Most of the readings, at least one of my cousins has been there with me. So it's been a really beautiful experience of reunion, and we're continuing to meet more family members through the process.
Thank you. That's an amazing story. Yeah. And so I have a side question before we get back to the form of the book, just generated by what you said. So have you gotten any feedback about the book from any folks that are connected to it through family heritage, but were not part of the collaboration?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm starting to get notes. There's a lot of celebration, which means a lot to me. So there's a lot of sharing the news and celebrating. We've also met some new cousins. I had a woman email me and say, I got this book from the library and I stayed up, I read it all weekend, and I think we may be related. And so I immediately put her in touch with Robert and Edie, who again are more thorough on the genealogy side. And they were able to say, oh, yes, we are related. And this is how you link into the family. So there have been a few amazing moments in that way. It's a gigantic family. So there may also be people who are disappointed that they weren't included. I mean, you can't, how do you represent 15,000 people? And we tried to represent points of view that couldn't even participate or didn't want to participate, but still were sort of at one end of the point of view. So we did have one cousin who was upset that I would be writing this book as a white descendant, which I think is completely valid and understandable given the long history of exploitation of white body or Black bodies, but Black stories as well. And so that I wanted her to be part of the book as this kind of more radical voice. She didn't want to participate in the book at all, but we still tried to include that point of view because first of all, I don't think there's any writing or conversing about race and racism without pain and without moments of awkwardness. And so we decided to keep those moments in because that's part of this process. And yet, overwhelmingly, there were many more moments of connection and incredible gracefulness as people shared from their life and they shared their research. So that has been the overwhelming feeling, but we also don't want to present this false Pollyanna experience of it all either.
Thank you for that. I'll just confess that that's what I was getting at.
Yes, like who's unhappy about this?
Yeah,
yes.
Because and without putting it that way, but recognizing that race and the not just the legacy of racism, but ongoing racism
exactly
in this country
Thank you.
cannot
exactly.
be. Yeah, we can't. There's no just hustling past it without having really difficult conversations and without acknowledging the harm and the pain and not just the harm and pain that has landed on Black bodies, but the flip side of that being the ways in which white folks have benefited
exactly.
from that. And so
I think that's really important. I think the word harm is important, and the benefit, and the point you just made about this is not just a historical event, it's ongoing. Yeah. Exactly.
So thank you for that. Yeah, it's complex, and so I appreciate you being candid about that, while also really appreciating the beauty and the hope really in the connections that you made. in this process. Yeah.
Definitely. And it's
I think that's required too.
Right. There's been a genuine and authentic desire to connect and feeling of connection, and a genuine desire to listen and learn, I think. So I think that has been an incredibly transforming experience. But you're right. We don't want to ignore harm, privilege, ongoing injustice. And that was actually one of the puzzles about writing this book, because the Banneker family had a very different reality from most people of color, because Benjamin Banneker's parents, including Mary, who I read about, she was just freed and she was arguing for the freedom of her children. And she had just married Robert Banneker, and they owned 100 acres. So they had liberty and they were landowners in a time when most people were enslaved. And so I wanted to write the book to celebrate them and actually honor their lives, but also not forget the fact that that was not the case for most people of color. And so to constantly be checking that privilege against the suffering and the absolute racial violence that was going on became kind of part of the mission.
Mm-hmm. And that is really important, because it is so important to make sure that people know, well, the whole truth, which includes the fact that there were Black landowners. And,
yes.
And before a certain point, before anti-miscegenation laws earlier, there were even interracial couples who
interracial couples
until folks figured out that they wanted to clamp down on Black liberty, for money.
Exactly.
And pardon my laughing. It's how I sometimes deal with the sort of emotional challenge when I'm speaking about these sorts of things. You got to laugh instead of crying. So,
definitely.
But so also having that story, because we tend to be very all or nothing about things, and like, oh, isn't it terrible that Black folks were enslaved? Often who benefited from that is left out, but also what's left out is how much more complex the lived experience of African descended people in this country has been.
Exactly.
Right? So
exactly.
Yeah. So really,
there's such a variety of experiences.
Yeah.
And so there were so many free people of color. There were so many mixed race families like this one, that there was actually like the governor of Virginia had a whole slur about all the women who were having children with African men. Yeah. And that was when everyone was indentured, when they hadn't, created the laws around race that led to the investment in slavery.
Right. In chattel slavery. Yeah.
Exactly.
Exclusive to African descended people. Yeah.
Exactly.
So I will stop doing that historical deep dive. Everyone needs to read the book, and also we'll talk later maybe about some other book recommendations. And so let's get back for now to the form of the book. The reading gives us a nice taste of the writing, which is, you've described it as creative nonfiction, which it feels different than just picking up a history book, right? Because you and your cousins, your collaborators, are really trying to create stories that allow the reader to kind of, get a real glimpse of people's lives, which you've had to sort of imagine in a way while also sticking to the facts. And then the way that you work in time is also very interesting. So please just talk about that, about the process and the form.
Thank you. Yes. So I really wanted them to live on the page as real people. And we were lucky to have a lot of documentary history. We can document them. And we also have oral history. And I think that the book really models itself on that kind of oral history telling, because what I'm amazed by African American oral history is the amount of accuracy and information in them. So, I mean, there's a whole country that denied people the right to their own families and to have records of their own families. And so what develops out of that in a lot of cases is this incredible, robust family history or oral history where the stories are kept generation to generation and they're told. And what I've noticed about oral histories is that they will have information, but you also get a sense of the personality and the person. And so I wanted to do the same thing. I wanted to use every bit of information we had. So all the documents we could find, the oral history that were taken in the beginning of the 1800s, a Quaker woman actually recorded oral histories about Benjamin Banneker that gives us the foundation to know about his family. So I wanted to use all of that and then also do some collaborative imagining about their personalities and what it felt like to be alive in that time. So that was those are the historical chapters. And then the present day chapters are really conversations. So they're just recorded conversations of me talking with my cousins and us grappling with this family history, but also with American history, which includes grappling with what we were taught and not taught, or the separate histories, how much white people haven't known about Black history. And so when Gwen is telling me stories of living in New York and being turned away time and time again in the 50s from apartments, those were important moments. It was important for me to hear even those more recent stories and to put that in the book. So that is a very roundabout way of saying that I tried to include a lot of different forms of knowledge in this book: documentary knowledge, oral history, and I guess imagined and relational knowledge.
Thank you for that. That's certainly it's wonderful that you've shared that, and also it feels very much like an endorsement to folks to read the book if they hadn't, because especially the ways in which you're in conversation between the past and the present, I think are really engaging.
Thank you.
So I want to take this moment to remind folks at home to send in your questions, and you can post them in the YouTube chat, or you can email us at virtualqa@malaprops.com, or I can just keep asking questions because they're going to keep coming out of my brain as well. But I would love for y'all to chime in. Please feel free. So you have referred often to the amount and varied types of research that you've done for the book. Love to hear a little bit more about that, and particularly what might have most surprised you, what felt brand new to you in terms of information you'd never heard and that perhaps was surprising.
Yeah, I felt like I was needing to educate myself on an American history I should have been taught, but I wasn't. So a lot of the things you and I were just touching on about the laws, the fact that first, when you had people from all over the world, including West Africa, including the Caribbean, who were indentured, and they were working people together. And so it was not uncommon to have what happened in our family with Molly, a British woman, having children with a Senegalese man. And I was fascinated and very disturbed by the laws naming whiteness and how these laws, as the working people started to band together, these laws were being passed to separate the working class and to take the British or white working class and make them believe they were really aligned with wealthy landowners through this wedge of race and racism. So you can see it being written into law as they're then increasing investment and creating this concept, as you said, of chattel slavery. So that was new to me. But then there were all these heroic moments that I also felt like, oh, I wish I had known how many free people of color there were. And entire towns, the Banneker family lived next to Mount Gilboa in Maryland. It was an entire town of free people of color. There were these allied families who would work together. They would buy land together. They would take care of one another. And they were just incredibly resourceful and agile in the way that they would survive. So I felt like there were these huge chapters of American history that had been subsumed by the story of suffering and these incomplete histories that we had been taught. So, and even this document that I read about today for Mary, I mean, what courage. As soon as she's freed from her indenture, she goes and starts arguing for her children's freedom. So there's all this hidden in the historical record. There are these incredible moments of strength all along.
Yes, absolutely. And it just occurred to me too that for anybody who's tuning in who hasn't read the book and may not know very much about Benjamin Banneker, because I mean he was an extraordinary figure, but also I think there's lots of folks who have probably never taken a class where he came up. Maybe that's changed recently, and I hope so. But
I hope so too.
But just a little bit about who Benjamin Banneker was.
So he was a free person of color, and he lived in the Revolutionary era. He was a self-taught scientist and a scholar. He was able to go to a couple years at a Quaker school. And then he was really self-taught and just read voraciously. When he was a young man, he designed a clock out of wood, having seen someone's pocket watch. He created his own clock, and then he started teaching himself astronomy in his 40s. And so he created an almanac and tried to get it published. And his first round, people didn't believe that a Black man could do this kind of higher mathematics and this science. And they took too long to kind of verify it. He didn't get it published. Well, the next year, he was then sort of on the map, and he was hired by Jefferson and Washington through his friend the Ellicotts to help survey Washington, D.C. So he worked as a surveyor, and he was in charge of the latest technology. He was in charge of the astronomical clock and charting the stars for the surveying work. Then he came back to his farm. At this point, he's in his 60s. And he's still learning and thinking, and had quite a buoyant spirit, I think, to be continuing through all of this. And he sent out his almanac to be published, and also wrote an incredible letter to Thomas Jefferson. So he sent a manuscript, a copy, to Jefferson, along with a cover letter, really calling Jefferson out for his hypocrisy as someone who wrote about freedom but was an enslaver. So it's a remarkable letter. Banneker's almanac was published. It became a bestseller, and he published almanacs for the next 7 years. And they were published in Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland. And his next year's almanac included the letters between him and Jefferson. So it became quite a talked about document, and made some political trouble for Jefferson.
Yeah. Extraordinary person.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing a little bit of that. So again, that whets the appetite, I think, to learn more about what for I think a lot of people is, just threads of hidden history traditionally for us. Yeah. So we have a question from the audience from Larry, who asks, besides Delaney and Lett, what are some other family names that have been found to be connected to the Banneker lineage?
Oh, that's a great question. There are many allied families, the Simpsons, the Tates, the Guys, the Posies. So there are communities, like I said, these communities of people would often marry one another. So those are all families that connect in. The Redmonds, my closer family is the Beebe family. But those are some of the main names that I can think of off the top of my head. There is a chapter in here called Revolution, where I talk a little bit about that community spirit, and I do list some of the names. I think that we will meet a lot more cousins through this process, actually.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Thank you for that question, Mary. And so I asked you before about feedback that you've gotten from other cousins out there who weren't involved in the process, but I didn't ask about your closer family, and how they've perceived and thought of this work, because in answering that question, if you can maybe just talk a little bit more about your discovery of this lineage as opposed to sort of having grown up and always known about it, right? And what that might have meant for other people in your family.
That's a great question, because one of my central insights from this process is that genealogy is not an individual acquisition. It is always a collective process. What you discover about yourself, you're discovering about others. And so there are tricky ways to navigate that in some ways. So I would say my family, my immediate family, has been amazingly supportive. And even my realm of first cousins, I'm actually surprised by the level of celebration, curiosity, embrace. One of my aunts and uncles who live in Asheville actually went on their own road trip to the sites to visit. And then my dad and mom came to the book release party, so they met all of their Black cousins, my dad's, for the first time, and also had a really beautiful kind of a reunion. I will say one cousin said, we all found out about this, that year, but you started writing a book. Like what, most people, it was like, oh, that's interesting. But I became obsessed with uncovering the history and writing the stories. And so he asked, what was that? Why did you need to do so much with this information? And I do think that just goes back to things that I had been thinking about my whole adult life, the kinds of communities I had chosen to live in these multiracial communities or communities of people who are working for racial justice. So it was a live topic for me. And it was a topic that I felt, it was a strand of genealogy that did not feel surprising to me and felt important to explore, more so than I would say my other first cousins. So they're supportive, and it's also a little curious. And it's also, I say this to my students all the time, it is not easy to show up in another person's book. Even if that person is trying to be careful and ethical, it's always a partial, it's always their lens on a situation. And so I know there are some moments that are probably uncomfortable for my family, or they feel like, oh, I wouldn't have framed it this way. But that's also just what happens when you write a book. And I had decided that I wanted to be as honest as possible, as clear as possible, but I didn't want to have a punitive, punishing relationships with my family of origin, because I had a really loving family of origin. And even my grandfather, who was from this line that had passed, he was part of this process for me. So it wasn't about just sort of going in like a lawyer and saying this, do you know what I mean? And so I tried to just contain it all to the extent I could.
Yeah. And I realize that this feels cliche at this point, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. It's important to acknowledge that, more than one thing can be true at a time, right? Jefferson is a prime example of that, right? And so, you're talking about, making an effort to not inject a sense of being punitive, into any of this, even while I think it sounds like a big part of this for you is interrogating your own whiteness and what that means, right?
Exactly.
In terms of your lived experience. And, it's also true that your family is wonderful, and that, for instance, while people living today are not directly responsible for, chattel slavery, for instance, still acknowledging what came out of that and all of the, versions of things since then that, and race-based policies that have just sort of have their tendrils, they continue to have their tendrils.
Exactly. And
that it's not like you're a bad person because you're, there's a lot of talk out there that's suggesting that when we're having these kinds of conversations, what we're saying is all white people are bad. And that's not it at all. And it's not,
that's
not even
way
about
too
that.
simplistic.
Way too simple.
But
and
it is
nobody's guilt is useful anyway. So right. We wouldn't even bother saying that.
Right. I mean, that ends up being another way to commandeer the conversation and take the resources, in a way, the resources of attention. I mean, it did feel really important to me to interrogate the myths and say, we are part of this story. We're part of it on a cellular level. And we're part of it because this is the American inheritance and that we have to look at. So all of it, all of that.
Right. And there's no reconciliation without truth, as we have seen.
Exactly.
Time and time again.
Or radical honesty, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great term to apply. So we have, if we're going to wrap up at 7, we've got 10 minutes left. And so I want to just put in one final reminder for any more questions from the audience. And also go ahead and give you the opportunity now to make any book recommendations for folks at home while they're thinking of more questions, or while I'm thinking of more questions. That's something we love to do for our viewers.
Yes, I love so if you like this kind of reading where you're looking into kind of what we've been told about history and digging beneath to see something else, I really recommend How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith. He's a poet, and I felt such a kindred spiritness to him in the way that he goes to historical sites and he looks at the way they are or are not reckoning with slavery and with racism. So it's a wonderful book. I recommend that. And then Master, Slave, Husband, Wife by Ilyan Wu, which is just out this year, is a great read. And it is exhaustively researched history. And it's about the Kraft family who left enslavement in the Carolinas, or no, Georgia, actually. So pretty far south, by Ellen Kraft dressing up as a white master, and her husband, William, pretended to be her enslaved servant. So they kind of hid in plain sight. And they used the stereotypes of the time, people thinking, oh, isn't that nice? He's such a good servant, to get themselves to freedom. And then they were part of the abolition movement in Boston. So that's a fascinating story. Again, a true story that we should know of these heroic people. And that's by Il-Yun Wu. I love the novels of Toni Morrison, the essays of James Baldwin. I read and reread them. Even his uncollected essays, there's a book called The Fire Next Time. I love that because it's they're very intense and opinionated in a way that resonates today, because we're living in such an age of an opinion. So that's a great book to read if you haven't read that one by him. And I love the novels of Jesmyn Ward too.
Excellent. All good recommendations. And I was trying to keep up with you in chat, so I will get back to that in a second. There's a more, I'll go ahead and mention a more recent collection of Baldwin's writings called The Price of the Ticket. It's a lot, but worthwhile. And, and because it's a collection, yeah, you can pick it up. And I've, watched several videos of his on YouTube, and there's something also about the way he is when he's talking about things that is
such a truth teller.
And it is so resonant today in a way that is both remarkable and extremely depressing in a way.
Yeah, exactly. That is like, so relevant because it hasn't changed enough.
Relevant. Yeah. I Am Not Your Negro. I'll go ahead and put a plug out for that film if anyone hasn't seen it. So I don't see any fresh questions. Let me just double check the email. And so what I would like to invite you to do now with the last few minutes, while I'm also putting in some more book titles in the chat for folks, is just to share final thoughts with us and what we've talked about a lot this evening. And thank you.
Thank you.
Again, thank you for your candor what, if anything in particular, you might wish for readers to take away from this book?
That's a great question. I would like readers to feel a little more empowered to participate in the conversation. I try to include the moments of awkwardness, as I said, just to acknowledge that is there. And yet to not shut it down. We need to illuminate history. We need to replace our myths with our real histories. And that's a summary of a Baldwin quote that opens the book. And so I would love that. I would love people to come away with a more factual history around race, and also to feel empowered to be in conversation about it. And to bring that conversation into the present so we can begin the work of listening to one another and healing and adjusting things. I mean, I think that healing needs a practical reparative aspect to it as well. But I really came to believe in a lot of things working on this book, in the reality of the ancestors and in the participation between the past and the present, and in the conversation as a space that's filled with possibility.
Thank you. So then my final question will be, what, if anything, are you working on next that you'd like to share?
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I am working on another ancestral book. So I am going to stay in this vein of nonfiction. And this one is looking closely at the constructions of gender.
Well, we'll look forward to that.
Thank you.
And hopefully we'll see you again. And with that, I'll say goodnight to everyone who's joined us this evening. We so appreciate your time and your attention. I encourage you to, if you have the means, to purchase Rachel's book, Benjamin Banneker and Us. And thank you, Rachel. Of course, we deeply appreciate it when you purchase from Malaprops, but if we're not your local indie, we just ask that you purchase from your local independent bookstore, wherever you are. And Rachel, we were talking before about the roles that libraries play as well, really as in civic society and democracy. So support your local libraries also, for sure. But if you have the means, please shop at independent bookstores. And there are quite a few of us, thankfully, still. So
holding on.
Yeah,
I
keep
love
us
it.
around.
Yes.
And we appreciate it. Yeah. Rachel, it's been wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Great to talk to you. I so appreciate what you do there. Thank you to Malaprops and to everyone who tuned in.
Thank you. We appreciate you. And so everyone, folks, take care. We hope to see you again. Stay safe and well until next time. And good night.